Hello and welcome back to our short lecture series on writing an EcoS term paper or an EcoS master's thesis or dissertation for that matter. Today we are going to talk about a very important part that is known as the literature review, sometimes also called state of the art. At the beginning, I will, as usual, remind you where we are standing in our overall structure of such a thesis. And then we will go through a number of points here, like what is a literature review, what are the main functions, what do you need to do, and so on and so on. And then we will conclude again with the number of points that you will get for your literature review on our standard EcoS grading form. So you see we now arrived at point number 2, literature review, which is still part of the theoretical part, which is part 1 out of 3 of your thesis or term paper. So what is it, this literature review? It is, first of all, an essential part of every research paper. And also, please be aware of that, the most extensive element of the theoretical part. Extensive in terms of page numbers, but also in terms of time that you have to invest. It will actually easily take the biggest share of the time that you need for writing either a term paper or a master's thesis, because it means that you really have to read a lot and you will have to try a lot. So you will read many works that at the end of the day you will find not really being that useful for you, but still you have to read them in order to find out whether they are useful or not. And this is actually quite a big challenge, and you need to be aware of that, right? So when you plan your research, you shouldn't think, okay, today and tomorrow I do literature review, and then on Saturday I'm gonna do the next part. That's not how it works. We talk about like weeks here. Reading is also not something that you can do like a machine, right? You can't read 300 pages in 1 hour. So really be aware of the fact that this will really take a lot of time. And then again, depending on your topic, but for many theses, this will be the most time-consuming effort that you actually make in the context of writing your term paper or thesis. What is it again? Literature review is something that helps you to stand on the shoulders of giants. I found this formulation somewhere and I found it actually quite useful. I mean, you're getting the image, right? A giant is a tall person, and if you stand on the shoulder of that tall person, even if you are not that tall, you will still be taller than that person because you're standing on his or her shoulder. So you can, your head will be even higher, right? So that's one of the ideas. We want to avoid, another point here on my slide, reinventing the wheel. The wheel has been invented. It's a great, useful tool. Nice. Let's move on. Let's not keep doing the same thing over and over again. This is not how progress is being achieved. Progress means that you understand what's there, identify deficiencies or additional needs, and focus on that, right? So you either improve an existing product or you find a product that hasn't been there before. And when I say product, of course, I'm not just talking about producing something in an economic sense, but also, you know, doing research, or it could be anything, right? So yes, that's the basic idea. You add your own ideas, results, etc., on top of what's already there. And in order to be able to do so, you need to know what is already there, and that's what the literature review is all about. A literature review is not the summary of others' books or articles. Sometimes I find this, it rather is a discussion in relation to your research question, so of relevance to your research. So it's not like you take a book and then just highlight the main ideas in there and put it in your literature review. You highlight the main ideas of that book that are somehow related to your research question. Well, if that's true for all of them, fine, but typically this is how you read nonfiction literature in an academic sense. You usually read selectively, right? So you look at chapters or aspects that are relevant for you and you omit the rest. This is clearly what you need to do. And name dropping is also something that should not be your top priority. I mean, it's not completely wrong to do name dropping. I will talk about this a little later as well, because it kind of improves the trust of your readers. They think, okay, I mean, they will be looking for certain names, right? If you write for an informed audience, like people who also know something about this topic, they have their own literature review done in the past, so they kind of know what's going on in the field, and they will expect you to mention a few names. And if you don't, then they might think that you haven't really read enough. So in that sense, name dropping is fine, but there's a subtle balance that you really need to keep. If name dropping is too obvious, if people get the impression that this is exactly what you do and not more, just name dropping, then this will have exactly the opposite effect. People will stop trusting you. They will think that you are just pretending to know what you're talking about, and they will stop reading, they will stop listening to you, and that's clearly not what you want to achieve. So be careful with this, okay? Again, final point here, to just repeat this, you need to discuss those works, not just listing them, discussing them. That's your job. You discuss them by identifying thoughts and debates. Like, okay, like book A says this, but then author B talking about the same topic comes to a different conclusion, or in direct response to that book A says this needs to be done differently. That's what I mean by debates and so on. Schools, sometimes you have schools like where people join together either physically or virtually by following a certain line of thought in certain direction. That is also part of what the literature review is all about, is identifying such discussions, identifying schools, and that's always very important. Final few words here on the slide. If all this is relevant for your research, and this is so difficult, especially if you spend a lot of time reading, you will find lots of interesting things, and it's so easy to kind of deviate from your actual path. Please focus on your own research. And what is your own research? That's defined by your topic and research question, as we have discussed previously. So that is absolutely important. I have identified 4 main functions of the literature review here on this slide. Number 1 is very simple, to improve your understanding of the topic. You need to know something already about it, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to formulate a good research question, or you wouldn't have chosen the topic actually. But now in a literature review, you have a chance to deepen your knowledge and also to demonstrate that to your readers, so that they see, okay, this is how the author has approached this topic, and this is where he started, and this is where she encountered interesting aspects in the literature, and so on and so on. Secondly, the literature review helps you to demonstrate your understanding of the topic to your readers. So improving your understanding, that's for you. Demonstrating this understanding to your readers is for your audience. Why is that important? Well, you see it on the slide. I'm pretty frank here. We do talk about showing off, kind of related to the name dropping remarks I made for the previous slide. Yes, of course. It's all about trust. Trust is so important. Look, if you write something, it's a monologue, right? So you will not have a chance to influence people through a discussion. You will not have a chance to influence them through body language or something. It's the only thing you have to convince your readers to first read your stuff and secondly believe you. The only chance you have is what you write, and you have only one shot at that, okay? And trust is absolutely essential. If people believe that you are competent, one way or the other, then they will even be willing to listen to you if you tell them something they didn't know before, or on which they had a very different opinion. And usually that's the aim of your research, right? You want to find an interesting research question. Interesting means either new or finding new answers to old questions, if you remember what we've been talking about. The problem is that people will be naturally skeptical, especially if you tell them something that kind of differs from what they used to know. And therefore, the literature review is one of the occasions where you can at least demonstrate that you're not just some random person who has no real idea, just came up with an opinion and now wants people to believe him. You need to demonstrate that at least you understand what has been done so far, so that they will be able to believe you when you venture into unknown territory. The third function would be to show what your research is building upon. This is kind of, the school topic here. Your readers will then identify you maybe as a liberal or as a neo-realist if you talk about international relations. Some will stop reading, if you have some ideologues amongst your readers and say, I read nothing from a neo-realist. Well, so be it. But the majority, especially the reasonable ones, and those are the ones that, of course, you're aiming at, they will understand, okay, this is the angle that is being taken. Frankly, this is not always the case. You will not, with all your topics, fit into a school. As we discussed before, there might be schools of thought on some issues, but not on everything. But in any case, people know what you are building upon, what the foundation is of your actual research. And then the final point, in more practical terms, the literature review provides the foundation for your analytical framework. That's your set of criteria according to which you want to proceed, will then enter into your empirical part, collect data and information, and so on and so on. This will be discussed in a separate short lecture, the analytical framework. Just briefly here, for that reason, your task is to answer a certain research question, right? And this research question needs to be answered systematically. And the literature review is where you show how others have tried to find a system to approach your or a related research question. And then you then in your analytical framework show how you design a system. And that system, again, coming back to trust, must be solid. It must be resting on a solid foundation. And this solid foundation is your literature review. Either because you find a nice system that you just want to adjust a little bit, or because you can actually show that nobody so far has done anything that comes close to a solid analytical framework, and that's why you have to build one by yourself, but not from scratch, but based on secondary research on related topic that you would then bring together. And I'm going to show you an example on the next slide for what I actually mean, because I understand that this sounds a bit esoteric if it's presented to you in just this very abstract way. So I guess you all have mobile phones, so I think that task is pretty simple. Our research question is, or our topic is comparing a Samsung Galaxy S20 and an iPhone 11, perhaps with a research question like which of those two fits my needs better, right? And here you have different scenarios, 1 to 7. Scenario number 1, that's exactly your research question or your topic, right? You go and try to find works on exactly that, on comparisons between those two particular smartphones. It's actually very unlikely that you will find much on that. Well, maybe on this you will find a lot, but if you translate that back into our academic work, it's actually the more specific your topic and research question are, and remember, they actually need to be specific, the less likely is it that you will actually find works on this. You will find definitely more on comparing Samsung smartphones and iPhones, because that has been done a lot for other models. And you see, to broaden the scope here, point number 3, literature works on comparing Android phones and iOS phones. Okay, iOS phones are iPhones, but for Android phones, you suddenly go beyond just Samsung smartphones, right? And then you see the whole thing becomes more abstract. Now you just compare two phones. You look for literature comparing two phones. The thing is, it can still be useful, right? Again, remember, you look for criteria for this comparison. So of course, comparing two phones might be offering you some new ideas on what actually to look at if you do such a comparison. Okay, if you find nothing on comparing two phones, then you look for works comparing two communication devices, or any two technical devices, or any two items. Well, Point 6 and 7 really don't make much sense here. You should actually be looking for something in the range of 2 to 5, and this is actually also very realistic. Again, not just for our particular example here, Galaxy S20 and iPhone 11, but also on most other topics that you are going to write about in your term papers or master's thesis. Okay, now we have an example that is perhaps more closely related to what we do here at EcoS. You have another comparison, and this time what you compare is the immigration policies of Japan and South Korea in the decade 2010 to 2020. Again, I came up with a few imaginary scenarios here on literature that you might or might not find. You first of all try to find works on your exact topic. So that's exactly a repetition of what we have up there. If you don't find anything on this, you broaden kind of the scope of your search, you widen kind of the gaps in the net that you lay out, or you adjust your search terms in a search engine or in a library catalog, and you look for comparing the immigration policies of Japan and South Korea in another decade, for example, in the 1970s. Right? So what you do is in the first step, you just drop the decade 2010 to 2020. You are more likely to find something on just comparing immigration policies of Japan and South Korea. If you don't find anything on that, you might look for works comparing the immigration policies of any two countries. Because at the end of the day, the task is more or less the same, right? Immigration policy that needs to be compared to the immigration policy of another country. It doesn't really have to be Japan and South Korea. Actually, my guess is that 3 is something where you will be most successful, because it is still close enough to what you actually want to do, but broad enough so that your chances of finding something will actually grow. If you don't find anything on a comparison of immigration policies, you have to move one level up in the abstraction staircase, and you arrive at immigration policies as such. Not books comparing them, but books about immigration policies. And this is actually the real art that you have to learn if you aren't already a master of it. Extracting criteria, analytical criteria for a comparison from a book that doesn't really compare. But any book is structured, right? I mean, look at the table of contents. That will already give you a first insight. If there's a book on the immigration policy of, let's say, Peru, this immigration policy must be structured according to certain issues, right? And you will find them. You will find that there must be laws, and there must be processes of determining those immigration policies, and there must be goals, perhaps, that are expressed. Then you might look at those immigration policies in more detail, and you will see that perhaps the number of immigrants will be regulated, the process of migration will be regulated, the quality of immigrants might be regulated, like, for example, requiring a university degree. You might find countries that perhaps apply a point system, where a number of criteria are condensed into an index, and so on and so on. So even though this is not about the comparison, you will still find your criteria, and you can then extract one of those for your analytical framework by, for example, saying, are there regulations in the immigration policy on the number of immigrants, on the quality of migration? Is there a transparent point system, and so on and so on, right? So you can find your criteria even for a comparison, even in books that do not compare. Okay, or immigration policies or immigration policies of any country. This is more or less the same. So I think this is where you will find a lot on points 4 and 5. Point 3, if you're really lucky, and 1 and 2, relatively unlikely. Again, just to remind you, because that is always the key problem usually when I read literature reviews, keep your eyes focused on target, right? How can you use that for your research? Not, this is an interesting book and I found this and this there. This is just, deviating from your actual path. Keep your eyes on target. Remember your topic and research question. This is why you are doing this literature review. And if it's not useful, skip that chapter, move on to the next one in the book. And if that book isn't useful, move on to the next book or article, okay? Keep your eyes on target. Do not waste time reading things that is not necessarily related to your actual research. Now, I don't want to discourage you from, reading stuff that's not related to something you're doing at the moment. The problem is that time is a factor, right? And if you want to write a term paper, usually the due date is somewhere after the semester, or your master's thesis. I mean, you want to graduate eventually, right? And not 10 years from now. So reading for the sake of your own enlightenment, of course, I always encourage that. But here we are talking about your actual thesis or term paper, so please keep focused, okay? Because your resources are limited. Okay, something that is a bit tricky is that you need to demonstrate that you found the major works on your narrow topic. Well, narrow topic, I think I already talked about. But major works, that's sometimes something where students are a bit uncertain about what that means. It of course depends on the actual topic and field that we are talking about. The thing here, the best indicator actually is that works that keep occurring in most of the sources that you use, these would then be considered to be major works. That doesn't mean that they need to be the best works, right? That's a difference. You might find papers usually starting by criticizing them. Francis Fukuyama, for example, and his End of History. That's a major work on a certain topic. But I think I found more papers and books and articles dismissing his idea that history has really ended with the collapse of the socialist system than works that followed up on that and said, yes, and now, let's build on this. But that doesn't make a difference. It is a major work, and because people feel like they have to refer to it, they have to cite it, they have to mention it. And then again, it's a process, this literature review, and the more you read, the better your understanding will be of major works. Of course, it also depends a bit on the field. If it's a very specialized field that you're working on, where you do not have such a huge number of works, it might actually be a closely knit community of 5 or 6 scholars worldwide who only write on that topic and nobody else does. In that case, it's a bit harder to identify major works in this way. But then on the other hand, basically every work these 5 or 6 people produce could perhaps be considered a major work. So this is kind of context sensitive, I have to admit, but I think you're getting a point here. It's not up to you to decide whether a work is major. I just wanted to say that as well, because you kind of liked it or something. No, you should stick to more neutral and objective criteria, like, again, a book being cited and quoted a lot. Well, you have those citation indexes. You might perhaps also want to use one of those where you can see whether a work has been quoted twice or 2,000 times. Again, there is a bit of a grain of salt that needs to be added here. Myself, coming from a field that is relatively small, North Korean studies, we do not get those high citation numbers with our publications, which doesn't mean that our work isn't influential or something. If you write about a more general topic, then you have thousands of citations. In other smaller fields, that might not be the case. But still, those citation indexes could provide a certain clue. And then, well, in rare cases, but please keep this to an absolute minimum, also the status of the author might help. Like if a Nobel Prize laureate writes a book, like Joe Stiglitz for economics or something, well, yes, I think then it's fair to argue this gentleman got a Nobel Prize, so, it must be a major work or something. But saying that, oh, this guy is a professor at the University of Vienna, no, I don't think that this is enough to classify everything that this person writes as a major work. There needs to be more than that, okay? Okay, and to repeat, what you need to do in your literature review is you review and discuss these works. That is, you identify the major concepts, show relationships between those various works and concepts, and repeat it. Always keep your research question in mind to make sure that you're staying on track, keeping your eyes on target. Next slide, I will provide you a brief example for that. Actually, not so brief, but it's actually pretty straightforward. I'm using my traffic light logic here again. So red is not so good, yellow is okay-ish, and green is actually what you should be aiming for. I've taken the example of Janos Kornai's book on the communist system or socialist system, political economy of communism, or I usually mix those up. Anyway, he writes about the political economy of the socialist system. And yeah, well, sentence number one in a literature review is really useless. What is that good for? What does it tell me? How do you stand on the shoulders of giants by just telling me that Janos Kornai writes about state socialist systems? No, there definitely needs to be more. This thing in yellow is a bit better, right? So you mentioned that there are interrelated pillars. You mentioned his main line of causality, and list also those 5 columns in his main line of causality. That's much better because it's more specific. Still, this is not enough. Does that really help you in order to move on with your work? It's an improved version of the first sentence here. But how would that help you to proceed? Do you discuss anything here? I don't think so. If you look at the part in green, you see the first part is pretty much the same as in yellow. And then, however, we add what Miller said and how he used this approach by Kornai for his own study on China and what he wanted to show by his study. But then you also see a critic like Mr. Wolf. I made those names up. These are not real. Who argued that certain elements of the main line of causality are not really necessarily working as Kornai claims they do, and so on and so on. So this is already showing you kind of a debate and being more specific in terms of the actual criteria and the actual points for criticism. So I think this is definitely much more what I'm looking for in a literature review. Okay, so yeah, I hope you find this example useful. Okay, moving on to what you should do in more detail. Well, first of all, kind of obviously, you need to collect sources. Hunt and gather. Unfortunately, this is how you have to start. You have to start from scratch. So you go to a library or do it offline or online, doesn't matter. And well, first of all, I guess you would look at book titles, or if it's an online catalog, you might be luckier because they might also be referenced in terms of the actual content and topic. But then you collect those sources, make sure they are relevant for your work. Sometimes the title just promises more than it can actually keep. And then you read them. You read them academically. Reading academically means not from page 1 to page 350, but skimming through them, right? What is it when we talk about sources? Well, articles from academic journals, chapters from edited volumes, whole books, working papers, and so on. These would be regular and relevant and, how do I say, accepted sources. Wikipedia articles, blog entries, newspaper articles do not necessarily count as sources. I'm kind of adding this not necessarily because then again, there might be a topic where they actually do, but in principle, that's not what we are looking for, especially not for your literature review. And if we are moving towards building your analytical framework, which is kind of the final purpose of that literature review. So please make sure that you focus on journals, chapters from edited volumes, books, or working papers. Okay, academic reading, you skim through those sources and extract ideas and arguments. Usually you should do that either if you read those books physically. Again, that depends really on your working style. You should have a notebook next to you, like an old-fashioned one, like paper, not a one that you can write on, with a keyboard, and then you have a pen or something, and then you write down ideas. I actually have come to appreciate reading PDFs because that means I can copy and paste certain parts of those that I find perhaps interesting for my later work. I paste them into a new document, add the page number and the actual source. So I kind of condense all that, keep it for later, because the first task is reading, right? Writing comes later. But then I have those relevant passages, and then I can decide, do I want to quote them or do I want to paraphrase them? I always already have the page numbers, so I can provide the appropriate source and do citation in the right style, and so on and so on. Another thing that I would suggest is that you write your research question on a piece of paper and kind of put it in front of you, especially while you are reading. This will help you to really focus and keep your eyes on target, as I have already said a couple of times today, right? I know it sounds a bit silly, but trust me, it helps sometimes. If you just print it, for God's sake, on a piece of paper and put it somewhere, to keep reminding you, okay, this is what I'm looking for, not some kind of sideline topic that might be interesting, but isn't really what you're looking for. Okay, clustering these sources, arrange them according to certain criteria. Well, if you've read something about brainstorming, this is exactly how it works, right? So first of all, you have your random ideas coming up, and then you kind of try to group them together with ideas that are kind of related, and then give those clusters names. That helps you to structure your ideas, right? So you start very broadly in the brainstorming and in the literature review. You still have your target in mind, of course, but you still have no real structure behind all this, but you have to start somewhere. So you collect all this information, then you cluster it, then you give names to those clusters, then perhaps you put 2 or 3 clusters together and give them a general name, etc. And this is how you will be able to organize your thoughts in the brainstorming or your literature in your literature review. There need to be connections between the sources and between the clusters. So you also kind of have to show how they are related to each other, either being about the same topic, then they become members of the same cluster, or standing opposed to each other, right? There are various options for this. After completing a literature review, this is kind of the goal you want to achieve, is you want to know how others approached your research question, if you're lucky, or a similar research question, which will be the most likely case. So what did others do, being faced with more or less the same or a similar problem as you are? What did they do? And then, of course, based on that, your decision that by the end of the literature you should already have made, okay, what am I going to do now? Now you see people have tried A, B, C, and D. A you didn't like, B was okay, C and D were total failures, so you go for B. Or you see they have tried A, B, C, and D approaches. You think all of them have their merits, but none of them is perfect, so you decide to come up with an E approach, like an eclectic approach, kind of taking parts of A, B, C, and D, but making sure that you don't put things together that are mutually exclusive, of course, right? So this is, at the end of the day, the goal that you have been working towards with your literature review. How do you structure such a literature review now? There are different things that you need to do. First of all, students very often forget that, because for you it's self-evident because you know what you're doing. But remember, there are readers reading your stuff, right? And they might not be as immersed in the topic as you are. So help them by saying, okay, this is my literature review on whatever, and I'm doing this with the purpose of. And then you say what you actually aim to do. By the way, it's also helpful for yourself because it reminds you, wait a second, this is what I wanted to do. Now, then for actual clustering or structuring, there are different options. Again, depending on your actual topic, chronology is the most used form of structuring and clustering something. Is not always the best, but it's definitely, I think, one of the most used because it's pretty simple and straightforward. You can go ahead according to advancements, like kind of major developments in a certain field. You could do this geographically, or, and I think that's more or less the thing that you should be aiming for, key issues. Like in our example, you look for a definition of a family, you look for religious and cultural aspects of families, of economic aspects, political aspects of a family, main controversies over the concept of family, and so on and so on, right? This is what we are looking for because it's kind of already the analytical framework that we are aiming at. So again, cluster the various sources, make sure that you identified it and highlighted the main concepts and ideas, and make sure that you discuss those various sources and concepts and ideas and contrast them with each other. That's what you need to do. So at the end of the literature review, you should have a pretty good idea what others have written about your topic and research question. And you should have a relatively clear idea of how you want to approach your own research. How do you know that you have reached that point? Well, it's the first line here on my slide. It's very simple. If you stop finding new ideas. It's kind of this curve of diminishing returns. You know, it will be very steep at the beginning. So with every book you read, there will be something new. And if you arrive at book 10 or 20 or something, the curve will flatten, and you will actually find out that, oh, it takes me 2 or 3 new sources to find one new idea. This is a good indicator that you are getting close to having finished your literature review. Right? Again, this can differ, this point. Students usually want me to give them numbers. Well, if you want me to do this, of course, it will be my great pleasure. So here they are. For a term paper, I expect at least 20 relevant sources, and for a master's thesis, at least 50. Problem is that doesn't really work in reality, because there might be topics where you have to present more, and there might be topics where there are no 50 relevant sources anyway, right? So that's really just a very rough rule of thumb to give you kind of a vague idea of what I expect. But in reality, we will really have to look at your actual topic to decide whether it's enough or not. But independent from these two numbers here, 20 and 50, I think what really matters is that you keep reading, and if you stop finding new ideas, this is actually the surest indicator that you have reached the point that you wanted to reach. Okay, and finally, as usual, how will I grade all this? You see, there are now 7 points out of 72, so that's definitely more than I gave you, for example, for topic and research question or relevance of research question. Still, I will discuss the literature review with you because it's part of the theoretical part. But as you see, there is still a stronger weight of this in the overall grading. And all these points here, they should look familiar to you, and you should now better understand what is meant by them. Well, this is it on the literature review. I hope this makes sense to you. You might want to watch this video again. You might want to stop it at some point. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me, of course. I'm always happy to clarify. And yeah, I thank you again for your attention, and look forward to talking to you for the next short lecture on how to write an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Until then, goodbye.